Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that everything you've built, your career, your relationships, your carefully constructed identity has been shaped not by you, but by a frightened 5-year-old hiding somewhere deep inside your chest. Imagine that every time you snapped at your partner over something trivial, every time you sabotaged a promising opportunity, every time you felt that gnawing emptiness despite your achievements, it wasn't really you making those choices. It was a child. A child who never learned they were safe. A child who never heard the words they desperately needed to hear. A child who is still waiting, even now, for someone to finally see them. You think you left childhood behind. You believe that maturity means transcending those early years, building walls of rationality and responsibility that separate the adult you from the vulnerable creature you once were. But what if that separation is the very thing destroying you? What if the mask of adulthood you wear so convincingly is actually a prison, and the prisoner is the most essential part of who you are? If this question unsettles you, if something in these words feels uncomfortably familiar, then what follows will change how you see yourself forever. Subscribe now, because you need to hear this. Not later, now. Consider this haunting paradox. The more you try to be an adult, the more you suppress your needs, silence your emotions, and perform strength you don't feel, the more childishly you actually behave. The executive who explodes over minor setbacks. The successful entrepreneur who crumbles at the slightest criticism. The parent who repeats the exact patterns they swore they'd never inflict on their own children. These aren't failures of willpower or character defects. They're the desperate acts of a child who was never allowed to be a child, now running the show from behind a curtain of supposed maturity. Carl Jung saw what most refuse to acknowledge. Within every adult lives an active, breathing, suffering child. Not a memory, not a metaphor. An actual psychic entity that continues to shape your thoughts, hijack your emotions, and write the script of your life in invisible ink. This inner child doesn't care about your graduate degree, your job title, or how many years you've been in therapy. It doesn't respect your carefully crafted image or your logical explanations for why you feel the way you feel. It simply exists, influencing everything, demanding nothing less than total recognition. But here's what makes this revelation both terrifying and liberating. You cannot kill this child. You cannot outgrow it, outsmart it, or meditate it away. Every attempt to bury it deeper only gives it more power. Every mask you wear to hide it only makes it scream louder in the darkness of your unconscious. The wounded child you're trying to escape is the same force that's been sabotaging your happiness, poisoning your relationships, and leaving you feeling fundamentally alone even in a crowded room. Why do you react with disproportionate fury to situations that objectively don't warrant it? Why do you feel invisible even when people are looking directly at you? Why do certain types of rejection feel like existential annihilation? Why can't you accept love when it's offered? Or why do you chase it desperately when it's withheld? Why does success feel hollow? Why does intimacy feel dangerous? Why do you keep repeating the same destructive patterns while swearing this time will be different? The answer isn't in your present circumstances. It's not in the behavior of others or the unfairness of the world. It's in the eyes of a child you've been trying not to see. A child who learned long ago that their needs were burdensome, their emotions were excessive, their very existence was somehow wrong. That child didn't disappear. They just learned to hide. And now they're running your life from the shadows, using the only language they know, the language of pain, need, and desperate survival strategies, dressed up as adult decisions. What if everything you think you know about healing, about growing up, about becoming whole, is backwards? What if the path forward requires going back? Not to wallow in the past, but to finally meet someone you abandoned long ago. Someone who's been waiting in the dark, alone, convinced they weren't worth saving. What if your freedom doesn't lie in becoming stronger, but in becoming softer? Not in building more defenses, but in dissolving them? Not in finally being adult enough, but in learning to hold the child you've been trying to kill? This isn't about nostalgia or self-pity. This is about survival. Because the child you're ignoring is destroying you in ways you can't even see. You were taught a lie so fundamental, so universally accepted, that questioning it feels like madness. The lie is this: emotional pain is something to overcome, to transcend, to leave behind as you mature. Childhood wounds are supposed to be outgrown, forgotten, rendered irrelevant by the passage of time and the accumulation of experience. Society handed you this script early: stop crying, grow up, be strong, move on, and you believed it. You had to believe it, because everyone around you was performing the same theater of false maturity. But Carl Jung understood what philosophers and therapists are only now beginning to grasp. Repression doesn't heal anything. It merely relocates the wound to a deeper, darker place where it operates with more power and less awareness. When you were told your emotions were too much, your needs too demanding, your sensitivity a weakness, something catastrophic happened. You didn't just learn to hide your feelings, you learned to exile an entire part of your psyche. You created an internal refugee, a child who carries all the vulnerability, all the unmet needs, all the raw emotional truth you weren't allowed to express. This is what Jung meant by the archetype of the inner child. Not a cute metaphor for innocence or nostalgia, but a living psychological structure inhabiting your unconscious mind. It's an autonomous entity with its own needs, fears, and ways of perceiving reality. And here's the horrifying part. This child doesn't grow up just because your body does. It remains frozen at the age when it was first wounded, when it first learned that being itself wasn't safe. Think of Nietzsche's concept of the eternal return, the idea that we're condemned to repeat our patterns infinitely unless we break the cycle through radical self-awareness. Your inner child is living this nightmare. It keeps recreating the original trauma in new disguises, desperately trying to get a different outcome. The partner who abandons you emotionally is the parent who was never present. The boss whose approval you chase obsessively is the authority figure who never validated you. The friend whose slight devastates you is the sibling who made you feel invisible. Different actors, same play, same wound. Schopenhauer spoke of the will as a blind, suffering force that drives all existence. Your wounded inner child is this will in miniature, a relentless force pushing you toward pain because pain is what it knows, what feels familiar, what paradoxically feels like home. You think you're choosing your relationships, your reactions, your life path, but how much of it is actually choice, and how much is a traumatized child pulling the strings, ensuring that the original wound stays open because an open wound is at least proof you were hurt, proof your pain was real. The existentialists understood that we're condemned to be free, yet most people flee from this freedom into what Sartre called bad faith, living inauthentically, wearing masks, playing roles that society demands. Your masks of maturity are textbook bad faith. The mask of the responsible one who always takes care of others. The mask of the strong one who needs no one. The mask of the successful one whose achievements never feel like enough. Each mask is a betrayal of the authentic self, which remains trapped in childhood, waiting to be acknowledged. Viktor Frankl discovered in the concentration camps that suffering ceases to be suffering once it finds meaning. But your inner child's suffering has no meaning because you won't even acknowledge its existence. You've spent decades trying to be the adult who has it together, never realizing that this very effort is what keeps you fragmented. The more you deny the child, the more it manifests in shadow form anxiety that appears without reason, rage that seems disproportionate, emptiness that no achievement can fill, and exhaustion that sleep can't cure. Jung observed that what we resist persists, and what we deny owns us. Your inner child doesn't need to be strong or mature or fixed. It needs exactly what it needed then, to be seen, heard, held, without judgment. But instead, you've become the parent who failed you, continuing the cycle of abandonment from the inside. Every time you tell yourself to get over it, to stop being so sensitive, to be rational about your feelings, you're inflicting the original wound all over again. You've internalized the voice that first hurt you, and now you're using it against yourself. This is why time doesn't heal these wounds. Time without awareness is just more years of the same abandonment, the same denial, the same exile of your truest self. Watch closely how this operates in the architecture of your daily life, in ways so subtle you've mistaken them for personality traits, for who you fundamentally are. The inner child you've exiled doesn't simply disappear into memory. It becomes the invisible architect of your present reality, designing your relationships, your career choices, your capacity for joy, and your tolerance for pain, all from behind a curtain you refuse to pull back. Start with your relationships. Notice the pattern you can't seem to break. You're drawn to people who are emotionally unavailable, or you choose partners who need saving, or you find yourself in relationships where you must constantly prove your worth. This isn't coincidence or bad luck. Your wounded child is seeking familiar terrain. It learned early that love comes with conditions, that closeness means pain, that abandonment is inevitable. So it builds relationships that confirm this worldview. Not because it wants to suffer, but because the known suffering feels safer than the terrifying vulnerability of genuine intimacy. The confirmation bias here is devastating. Your unconscious child filters reality to match its expectations. When someone shows you consistent love, the child can't process it. It doesn't match the internal schema. So you unconsciously sabotage it, create conflict where none exists, or simply feel numb to the affection being offered. But when someone withdraws, criticizes, or abandons you, the child wakes up fully. Finally, something that makes sense. Finally, proof that the original wound was justified. This is why you can feel more alive in toxic relationships than in healthy ones. Your inner child is finally getting validation not for its worth, but for its belief that it's unworthy. Consider your professional life through this lens. The chronic procrastination, the perfectionism that paralyzes, the inability to claim your achievements, the compulsive overwork that leads to burnout. These aren't productivity problems. They're symptoms of a child who learned that their value is conditional, that they must perform to deserve existence. The eternal child Jung described lives here refusing adult responsibilities because growing up meant losing the freedom to simply be, meant entering a world where love became transactional and presence became performance. Your nervous system tells the story your conscious mind won't acknowledge. The anxiety that spikes when you're alone, the panic attacks that seem to come from nowhere, the chronic tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your stomach, the insomnia that no sleep hygiene can fix. These are not biochemical accidents. They're the body keeping score, as Bessel van der Kolk would say. Your inner child is trapped in perpetual survival mode, perceiving threats that your adult mind knows aren't there. But your child's nervous system can't distinguish between then and now. The cultural conditioning amplifies this wound exponentially. You live in a society that worships productivity, emotional control, and independence, while pathologizing vulnerability, need, and interdependence. The wounded child inside you is drowning in a culture that demands you perform strength you don't feel, maintain an image that exhausts you, and achieve milestones that feel hollow. Social media becomes a theater where everyone's inner child is desperately performing for validation while pretending not to need it. The loneliness epidemic isn't about physical isolation. It's millions of wounded children wearing adult masks, unable to connect, because connection requires showing the face behind the mask. Watch how this shapes your relationship with yourself, the brutal inner critic that never rests, the shame that surfaces when you show need or weakness, the contempt you feel toward your own emotions. You've become the punishing parent to your own inner child, continuing the cycle of invalidation. When you fail, you don't offer yourself compassion, you attack. When you're hurt, you don't comfort yourself. You tell yourself to get over it. When you need help, you don't reach out. You withdraw in shame. You've perfected the art of self-abandonment. The existential consequence is perhaps most devastating. You're living someone else's life. The choices you make, the values you uphold, the person you present to the world, how much of it is authentically yours, and how much is a traumatized child's desperate attempt to finally get the love that was withheld. You climb ladders leaning against the wrong walls. You chase achievements that feel empty upon arrival. You build a life that looks successful from the outside while feeling bankrupt on the inside. And you wonder why nothing fills the void, never realizing the void isn't lack of something external, it's the absence of your own presence in your own life. Here's the revolution that changes everything. You don't need to heal the inner child. You need to meet it, not as a problem to be solved, not as a weakness to overcome, but as the most honest part of yourself that's been waiting in exile for someone to finally see it without flinching. The radical shift Jung proposed wasn't about becoming stronger or more mature in the conventional sense. It was about developing what he called the internal paternal ego, the capacity to become, for yourself, the parent you never had. This isn't self-help. This is psychological rebellion against every message you internalized about who you're supposed to be. It's the deliberate dismantling of the masks you've worn for so long they fuse to your face. It requires something most people never develop: the courage to stop abandoning yourself. The first act of rebellion is recognition. Not intellectual understanding. You can read every psychology book and still miss this entirely. Recognition means catching yourself in the moment when the wounded child takes control. You snap at your partner over something trivial. Instead of justifying your reaction or suppressing it with guilt, you pause, you notice, you ask, who just reacted? And if you're honest, it wasn't the adult. It was a child who learned that anger was the only safe emotion, or a child who's terrified of being dismissed, or a child who equates any correction with total rejection. This simple act of witnessing, of creating space between the reaction and your identification with it, is revolutionary. You're no longer the child. You're not suppressing the child. You're becoming the adult who can hold the child's experience without being consumed by it. This is the internal paternal ego emerging. It says, I see you're hurting. I'm here. You're safe now. The second rebellion is validation. Your inner child doesn't need you to fix its pain or explain it away. It needs you to stop gaslighting it. For years, you've told yourself your pain was irrational, excessive, unjustified. You've minimized your wounds because others had it worse. You've denied your needs because needing felt like weakness. Stop. The child within you experienced what it experienced. The wound was real. The pain made sense given the circumstances. Validation isn't wallowing. It's acknowledging reality without the toxic overlay of shame. Practice this. When difficult emotions arise, speak to yourself as you would to a frightened child. Not with patronizing platitudes, but with genuine presence. Of course you're scared. That makes complete sense given what happened to you. I'm not leaving. We'll get through this together. This internal dialogue isn't self-indulgent. It's the construction of a new psychic structure, one that can hold pain without fragmenting. The third act of rebellion is boundary setting. Your wounded child learned to betray itself to maintain connection with caregivers. It learned to shrink, to accommodate, to accept crumbs and call it love. Now, as the adult developing your internal paternal ego, your job is to protect that child from repeating these patterns. This means saying no to relationships that require you to diminish yourself. It means walking away from environments that consistently invalidate your reality. It means choosing temporary loneliness over chronic self-betrayal. History shows us what this looks like in practice. Jung himself underwent his own descent into the unconscious, what he called his confrontation with the inner depths, where he actively dialogued with the fragmented parts of his psyche. He didn't emerge healed in some final sense. He emerged integrated, able to hold the tension of opposites within himself, the wounded and the whole, the child and the adult, the vulnerable and the strong. Consider also the radical self-honesty of Dostoevsky's characters, who descended into their own psychological hells and emerged with something resembling authenticity. Or Rainer Maria Rilke's understanding that our deepest wounds are also our most profound teachers, that the very thing we've been trying to escape contains the key to our liberation. The rebellion isn't about becoming invulnerable. It's about developing the internal capacity to stay present with your own vulnerability. It's learning that you can be your own safe place, that you don't need to wait for the world to finally see you. You can see yourself. And in that seeing, everything shifts. Something inexplicable happens when you finally stop running from the child you've been carrying all these years. The transformation isn't what you expected. You don't become fixed or healed in some permanent sanitized way. You become whole. And wholeness, you discover, includes the wound. It includes the scar tissue. It includes the tenderness that never fully disappears. But now, instead of these things controlling you from the shadows, they become part of your conscious awareness, integrated, acknowledged, no longer demanding to be hidden or healed, just asking to be included in who you are. This is Jung's ultimate revelation about the inner child archetype. It's not an obstacle to overcome on the path to individuation. It is the path. The wounded child, when finally witnessed and held, transforms into what Jung called the divine child, the aspect of your psyche that carries your deepest creative potential, your capacity for wonder, your ability to experience life as sacred rather than as a problem to be solved. But this transformation can only occur through integration, never through rejection. Here's what you need to understand at the deepest level. Your inner child isn't something you had in the past. It's something you are, right now, in this moment. Reading these words, there's a part of you that's still 5 years old, or 7, or 12, frozen at the moment when the wound first occurred. That part hasn't aged a day. It's been in a holding pattern, waiting for conditions to be safe enough to finally emerge, to finally be seen without judgment, to finally express the needs that were deemed too much. And when you create those conditions yourself, when you become the adult who can meet that child with presence, instead of dismissal, a strange paradox reveals itself. The pain you've been running from your entire life wasn't the problem. The running was the problem. The wound itself, when finally acknowledged, becomes a portal to depth, to empathy, to a more authentic way of being human. You stop seeing your sensitivity as weakness and recognize it as the source of your capacity to truly feel life. You stop seeing your needs as shameful and recognize them as the very thing that connects you to others. You stop seeing your pain as proof of brokenness and recognize it as proof that you were alive, that you felt, that you mattered enough to be hurt. This is where most teachings on healing fail catastrophically. They promise you'll transcend the pain, rise above it, become stronger than it. But Jung understood something more profound. You don't rise above the wound. You descend into it. You let it shatter your false identities, your performed maturity, your desperate grasping for invulnerability. And in that shattering, in that willingness to be broken open, you discover something that was always there, but couldn't be accessed through the armored self you constructed your actual life force, unfiltered and undiluted by decades of self-protection. The people who've truly done this work are unmistakable. They carry their wounds openly, not as badges of honor or excuses for behavior, but as simple facts of their existence. They don't need to prove their strength because they're no longer afraid of their vulnerability. They don't need constant validation because they've learned to validate themselves. They can be present with others' pain without fixing or fleeing because they've learned to be present with their own. They've stopped performing and started existing. Think about what this means for the life you're actually living, not the life you imagine you should be living. When the inner child is no longer running the show from the shadows, your relationships transform. You stop choosing partners who recreate your wounds and start choosing people you can actually build something real with. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy and drama for depth. You can recognize love when it's offered because you're no longer convinced you don't deserve it. You can offer love without losing yourself because you're no longer terrified that giving means disappearing. Your work transforms too. You stop seeking worth through achievement and start creating from genuine curiosity. The desperate need to prove yourself dissolves because you're no longer trying to earn love through performance. You can tolerate failure because failure no longer means you're fundamentally defective. You can receive feedback because criticism no longer feels like annihilation. The energy you've spent maintaining masks becomes available for actual creation. But the deepest shift happens in your relationship with yourself. You become someone you can trust, not because you're perfect or because you never make mistakes, but because you know that no matter what happens, you won't abandon yourself. You won't betray your needs. You won't gaslight your experience. You won't demand that you be other than you are. This is the internal security that no amount of external validation can provide, the knowledge that you will show up for yourself, that you will be the adult your inner child needed all along. This is what it means to heal your inner child, and in doing so, to heal your life, not to erase the past or pretend the wounds don't exist, but to create a present where those wounds no longer define your possibilities, to build a relationship with yourself based not on performance or perfection, but on the simple, radical act of presence, to finally stop waiting for someone else to save you and become the one who shows up. Jung said the meeting with oneself belongs to the more unpleasant things that can be avoided as long as we possess other possibilities for outward distraction. But eventually, the distractions fail. Eventually, you're left alone with the truth that's been waiting beneath every achievement, every relationship, every attempt to be anyone other than who you actually are. And in that moment of facing, when you finally turn toward the child you've been fleeing, when you finally say, "I see you, I'm here, I'm not leaving," in that moment, you don't just heal a wound, you reclaim your life. The question isn't whether you have an inner child that needs attention. You do. Everyone does. The question is, how much longer will you make that child wait? How many more years will you spend performing adulthood while a frightened, lonely part of you watches from the shadows, wondering when it will finally be safe to come out? How much more of your life will you sacrifice to the masks you've worn, the roles you've played, the person you think you should be? Your inner child isn't a problem to solve. It's you, the truest, most vulnerable, most alive version of yourself that got buried beneath layers of protection and performance. And it's been waiting. Not for perfect conditions, not for the right moment, just for you to finally look in its direction, to finally acknowledge what's been true all along, that you were wounded, that it mattered, that you deserved better then and you deserve better now, that the life you've been living fractured, exhausted, never quite enough, isn't the only option. There's another way. It begins with a child. It begins with you. It begins now.